The Sovereign was not merely a restaurant, it was a gilded sanctuary, a silent theater where the gods of capital and influence convened. The air itself seemed filtered through wealth, thick with the scent of old money, truffles, and the subtle, sharp aroma of ambition. Light from colossal crystal chandeliers, hung like frozen constellations, did not illuminate the room so much as it dripped onto the tables, catching the edges of polished silver and the facets of diamond rings. The sound was a carefully orchestrated symphony of discretion, the muted clinking of utensils against bone china, the hushed murmur of conversations that could sway markets or topple governments, the nearly inaudible footsteps of the staff on plush, blood-red carpeting designed to swallow secrets. Here, power was the main course, and the staff were expected to be ghosts, efficient and invisible, their purpose to facilitate the desires of the titans, without ever imposing their own humanity. They were the silent, moving architecture of a world that was not their own, a world where a single meal cost more than their yearly salary. And they were trained to perfection in the art of being present but unseen, attentive but forgotten. Elena Ortiz moved through this opulent world with a grace that was both practiced and innate. Her black uniform was immaculate, a stark, simple silhouette against the room's Baroque splendor, serving as both a suit of armor and a cloak of invisibility. Her movements were a fluid ballet of efficiency. She refilled water glasses before they were half empty, cleared plates with a whisper of motion, and anticipated the needs of her patrons with an intuition that bordered on precognitive. To the diners, she was a pair of hands, a polite nod, a fleeting presence at the edge of their vision. But beneath this placid professional surface, a universe of carefully managed grief and unyielding resolve churned. Her serene expression was a dam holding back a torrent of memory, a quiet fortress built to protect a heart that had been shattered years ago. Each step she took on the plush carpet was a step she had been forced to take away from her own dreams. Each polite smile a mask for the cold, simmering anger she carried deep within her bones, an anger reserved for the kind of men she now served every single night. Inside her mind, beyond the orders for vintage Bordeaux and seared foie gras, the sterile, antiseptic scent of a hospital intensive care unit was a permanent resident. She could still feel the ghost of her younger brother Mateo's hand in hers, his grip weakening with each passing day. He had been brilliant, full of life, his laughter, a melody that had been stolen from her world. Elena had been at the top of her class, a promising pre-med student specializing in hematology, her future a bright, clear path toward saving lives. That path had crumbled the day Mateo was diagnosed with a rare and savage blood disorder. A small, innovative biotech firm had developed a cure, an affordable, groundbreaking treatment that was their only hope. But that hope was extinguished overnight, acquired and then deliberately buried by a pharmaceutical behemoth, Finch Pharma, to protect the patent on their own, far more expensive and less effective drug. The decision, made in a sterile boardroom by a man she'd never met, had been a death sentence for Mateo and countless others. It had bankrupted her family, shattered her parents, and forced Elena to trade her textbooks and lab coat for a server's apron to keep their home from being repossessed. Her most guarded secret was not the depth of her sorrow, but a biological truth imprinted on her very cells, a secret she shared with her lost brother. Elena possessed one of the rarest blood types on Earth, Rh null, a substance so precious and unusual that scientists had dubbed it golden blood. It was the ultimate universal donor for those with other rare blood types, a key that could unlock life, yet it flowed in the veins of fewer than 50 people on the entire planet. The physical manifestation of this genetic miracle, the one visible sign passed down through their family line, was a small but distinct birthmark on the inside of her left wrist. It was a tiny, perfect five-pointed star, a pale rose constellation against her olive skin. She often kept it covered by the sleeve of her uniform, not out of shame, but because it was the last, tangible link to Mateo. It was their shared crest, a silent, secret emblem of a bond, that not even death or corporate greed could fully sever. Her abandoned studies gave her a chillingly precise understanding of its value. She knew she was, in biological terms, one of the most priceless human beings alive. The atmosphere in the Sovereign, already charged with quiet tension, shifted palpably when Alistair Finch arrived. It was as if a predator had entered the ecosystem, causing a subtle, instinctual ripple of anxiety. He did not walk into the room, he consumed it. His suit was a fortress of tailored charcoal wool, his shoes gleamed with a predatory shine, and his presence radiated an aura of absolute, unapologetic power that bent the very air around him. The maître d', a man who regularly greeted world leaders with stoic indifference, became instantly obsequious, his posture dipping into a subtle bow. Alistair Finch did not acknowledge him. He moved through the restaurant as if it were his personal property, his eyes sweeping over the other patrons with a look of bored appraisal, dismissing them as lesser creatures. He saw the world not as a collection of people, but as a series of assets and liabilities, and everyone he encountered was instantly categorized. The staff, in his eyes, were not even on the ledger. They were simply part of the operational cost, as inanimate and inconsequential as the silverware. He was seated at one of Elena's tables, but he did not order. Instead, he immediately pulled out his phone, his face a mask of thunderous rage. His voice, though kept low, was a weapon, sharp and brutal, slicing through the restaurant's hushed ambiance. Elena, standing a respectful distance away, could not help but overhear the frantic, commanding words. "I don't care what the global registry says," he snarled into the device. "Money is not the object. I could buy the entire blood bank. Find me a donor." There was a pause, and his face seemed to crumble for a fraction of a second, revealing a raw, terrifying vulnerability beneath the anger. "My son, Leo, is dying. It's RH null. You have to find someone. There has to be someone." The name of the blood type struck Elena like a physical blow, a shard of ice piercing the carefully constructed walls of her composure. For a moment, the opulent restaurant dissolved, and she was back in the hospital, hearing those same words spoken by a doctor with pity in his eyes. Alistair's fury, fueled by his powerlessness, needed a target, and Elena was the closest one. He snapped his fingers without looking up from his phone, a gesture of pure, unthinking command. "You!" he barked in her general direction. "This water, it's not cold enough." Is it that difficult to perform a simple task? The insult was casual, impersonal, the kind of careless cruelty one might show to a malfunctioning appliance. He didn't see her. He didn't see a person with a history, with feelings, with a life. He saw only a functionary who had failed. For Elena, the moment was clarifying. A cold, heavy calm settled in her veins, solidifying her resolve. This was the voice. This was the arrogance. It was the sound of the men in boardrooms who debated profit margins while lives hung in the balance. In her mind, the image of Matteo, pale and frail in his hospital bed, rose with searing clarity. She held Alistair's dismissive gaze for a second too long, her own eyes reflecting a depth of silent fury that he was too self-absorbed to ever notice. She simply nodded, her professionalism a perfect shield. Desperation was making him careless. Still on the phone, his voice laced with frantic energy, he began describing the one faint hope his researchers had given him. "There's a marker," he said, his voice strained. "A genetic trait associated with the few families that carry this bloodline. They told me to look for it, as if it were that simple. A birthmark. On the inside of the wrist. Star-shaped." As he uttered those final fateful words, Elena moved to his table to replace the water glass he had condemned. It was a routine movement, an action she had performed 1,000 times. But in that moment, the cuff of her uniform sleeve, just a fraction too loose, slid back an inch. As she reached forward, the soft, golden light from the chandelier above caught the delicate skin of her inner wrist, illuminating the tiny, perfect, five-pointed star that was etched there. It was a secret signature, a map of her own blood, now laid bare under the gaze of the one man in the world who was desperately searching for it. The sound of Alistair Finch's $1,000 smartphone clattering onto the plush carpet was unnervingly loud in the sudden silence that enveloped their table. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes, wide with a dawning, horrified disbelief, were locked onto her wrist. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale color. The mask of the corporate titan, the ruthless CEO, the master of the universe, shattered into a million pieces. For the first time that night, he looked up and truly saw her. He wasn't looking at a waitress anymore. He was looking at a ghost, a miracle, the impossible answer to a prayer he didn't believe he was worthy of making. The entire opulent world of the sovereign seemed to shrink, collapsing into the space between the billionaire and the invisible woman who held the life of his son in her veins. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The shift in Alistair Finch was not merely a change in expression. It was a tectonic event, a complete reordering of his internal universe. The air around him, once charged with his arrogant authority, became a vacuum. Time itself seemed to slow, to congeal. The ambient sounds of the restaurant, the distant laughter, the soft music, the clink of a fork, fading into a dull, distant roar. His mind, a finely tuned machine for calculating risk and profit, had short-circuited. It struggled to reconcile two impossible, contradictory truths. The symbol of his only hope, the mythical, unobtainable key to his son's survival, was imprinted on the skin of a creature he had deemed utterly insignificant. A waitress, a functionary. He felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, as if the plush, stable floor of the sovereign had fallen away, leaving him suspended over an abyss of his own making. The carefully constructed edifice of his power, built on the unshakable belief that anything and anyone could be bought, was crumbling to dust in the face of a simple, star-shaped mark on a woman's wrist. Elena felt his gaze not as a look, but as a physical weight, a brand of sudden, unwanted significance. For years, she had perfected the art of invisibility, of moving through this world without leaving a ripple. Now she was the epicenter of this man's cataclysm. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, coiled in her stomach, but it was immediately overtaken by something else, something harder and more ancient. It was the same icy resolve she had felt standing by Matteo's bedside, the same silent vow she had made to his fading memory. Her first instinct was a primal urge to hide, to pull her sleeve down and retreat back into the comfortable shadows of anonymity. But she resisted. She held her hand steady, her posture unchanged, forcing him to continue looking, to truly see the person he had dismissed. In her mind's eye, the image of Matteo was superimposed over Alistair's shocked face. Matteo, smiling, his own wrist bearing the same secret crest. This wasn't just her birthmark anymore, it was her brother's. It was their legacy. And it would not be devalued or bartered away by the man who had already stolen so much. His voice, when it finally returned, was a ragged, broken thing, a mere fragment of the booming instrument of command he had wielded moments before. He spoke her title, waitress, not as a name, but as a question, as if the word itself had become alien in his mouth. He pointed a trembling finger, his hand shaking so violently that the diamond on his ring cast fractured, panicked shards of light across the table. He was trying to form a sentence to articulate the maelstrom of shock, desperation, and dawning horror that was raging within him, but the words would not cohere. He was a man who had commanded boardrooms, intimidated world leaders, and moved markets with a single word, yet he was rendered utterly speechless by a glimpse of skin. He looked from her wrist to her face, his eyes pleading, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything that would make sense of the cruel, impossible miracle that had just unfolded before him. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was just a father, terrified and stripped bare of all his power. The delicate ecosystem of the sovereign was beginning to register the disturbance. Jean-Pierre, the maître d', who moved with the silent grace of a seasoned diplomat, began to drift toward their table, his expression a perfect mask of polite concern that concealed a growing alarm. A disruption of this magnitude, involving a patron of Alistair Finch's stature, was a cardinal sin in this temple of discretion. The other diners remained largely oblivious, cocooned in their bubbles of wealth and influence, but a few nearby tables had fallen quiet, their occupants sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The air had grown thick with unspoken questions. For Elena, this mounting attention was a cage slowly closing around her. She knew she had only moments before this intensely personal confrontation became a public spectacle, and her quiet life, the fragile peace she had fought so hard to build for her parents, would be shattered forever. She had to take control of the narrative, and she had to do it now, before he did. Elena slowly, deliberately retracted her arm. She did not snatch it away in fear, but moved with a newfound authority, a quiet grace that was no longer about servitude but about self-possession. The subtle shift in her posture was profound. Her shoulders, once held in a posture of professional deference, straightened. Her chin lifted by a fraction of an inch. When she finally spoke, her voice was unrecognizable. The soft, accommodating tone of a server was gone, replaced by a voice that was low, clear, and imbued with an unshakable calm that was more unnerving than any shout. She met Alistair's frantic gaze without flinching, her own eyes dark and steady. "Yes," she said, the single word cutting through the tension with the finality of a judge's gavel. "It is what you think it is." She offered no further explanation, no emotion, just a simple, devastating confirmation that left him no room for doubt or negotiation. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Alistair Finch's mind, finally rebooting, defaulted to its core programming, acquisition. If something was valuable, you bought it. If someone had what you needed, you made them an offer they couldn't refuse. His desperation clawed its way back into the form of arrogance, his fear transmuting into a frantic need to control the situation. He scrambled to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, a sound that made Jean-Pierre visibly wince. He grabbed Elena by the arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and began pulling her towards a secluded service alcove, away from prying eyes. "We need to talk," he hissed, his voice a low, urgent growl. "In private." Now, he was no longer asking. He was commanding, attempting to drag reality back into a framework he understood, a transaction, a negotiation, a deal to be closed. He saw her not as a person, but as a priceless, living resource that he had to secure at any cost. He pushed her into the narrow space between a wine refrigerator and a stack of polished service trays. The cold air from the cooler washed over them, a stark contrast to the warmth of the dining room. The opulent world of the sovereign was just a few feet away, but in this cramped, sterile corridor it felt like a different universe. This was the backstage, the engine room, and here, Alistair Finch believed he could dispense with the niceties. He let go of her arm and immediately reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek black leather checkbook and a pen worth more than her monthly rent. "Name your price," he said, his voice regaining some of its former confidence. "I will write you a check right now, any number you want. 1 million, 10 million, just name it. I'll buy you a house. A car. I'll set you up for life. Everything has a price, and I am prepared to pay it." He held the pen poised over the blank check, his eyes gleaming with the certainty of a man who had never encountered a problem that money could not solve. For Elena, his words were not an offer, they were the ultimate desecration. Each syllable was a fresh insult laid upon the deep, unhealed wound of her brother's death. This was the very logic, the cold, brutal calculus that had condemned Matteo. A life weighed against a profit margin, a cure shelved to protect a patent, a family destroyed for a quarterly earnings report. The name, Finch Pharma, echoed in her memory, and the connection, once a horrifying suspicion, solidified into absolute, sickening certainty. This man, standing before her with his checkbook and his casual assumption that her very biology was a commodity to be purchased, was not just a desperate father. He was her brother's executioner, a fury so pure and so cold it felt like ice water flooding her veins rose up within her. It was a silent, clarifying rage that burned away all fear, all hesitation. She finally understood. This was not a random encounter. This was a reckoning, delivered by a fate that had a long and patient memory. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching. The image of Matteo, pale and struggling for breath in his final days, burned brightly behind her eyes, fueling her resolve. She saw the astronomical hospital bills that had ruined her father, the endless nights her mother had spent weeping, the death of her own dreams in the sterile white halls of that hospital. All of it, every ounce of her family's suffering, could be traced back to a decision made in a boardroom by the man now begging to buy her blood. She slowly shook her head, a small, deliberate movement that carried the weight of years of silent grief. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, yet it struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Some things," she said, her tone devoid of all emotion, "are not for sale." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet, absolute finality in her words was more powerful than any scream of outrage could ever be. Alistair stared at her, his face a mask of utter incomprehension. The concept was alien to him. He lived in a world where everything had a price tag, where human desire, loyalty, and even life could be quantified and negotiated. Her refusal was not just a rejection of his offer, it was a rejection of his entire worldview, a denial of the fundamental law that governed his universe. His desperation, unable to find purchase, curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. If he couldn't buy her, he would break her. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he snarled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, threatening growl. He took a step closer, invading her personal space, using his physical size to intimidate her. "I can destroy you. I can have you blacklisted from every job in this city. You will be serving coffee from a cart on the street corner by next week. You think you can say no to me?" His face was contorted in a sneer of disbelief and fury, the mask of the desperate father gone, replaced once again by the ruthless corporate predator. It was at that moment that Jean-Pierre arrived, his face a pale, taut canvas of professional panic. He had seen Alistair drag the waitress away, had heard the raised voice, and knew he had to intervene before the situation spiraled into a full-blown scandal that could tarnish the sovereign's pristine reputation. "Mr. Finch, is there a problem? Perhaps I can assist," he said, his voice smooth as silk, attempting to de-escalate the confrontation. Alistair rounded on him, seeing not a mediator but an instrument to reassert his dominance. "A problem?" "Yes, there's a problem," he boomed, his voice now loud enough to carry into the dining room, causing several heads to turn. He pointed a damning finger at Elena. "This employee has been insubordinate and disrespectful. I want her gone. Now, fire her." It was a pure power play, a way to punish her for her defiance, to prove that even if he couldn't have what he wanted, he could still inflict consequences. He needed to re-establish the natural order of his world, where he gave commands, and others obeyed. Jean-Pierre looked from Alistair's furious face to Elena's unnervingly calm one. He was a man caught between an immovable object and an unstoppable force. His loyalty was, by necessity, to the restaurant and its most powerful client. His own livelihood depended on keeping men like Alistair Finch happy. With a look of profound regret, he turned to Elena. His voice was low and formal, stripped of all warmth. "Elena, I'm afraid I have to ask you to collect your belongings. and leave the premises immediately. Your employment here is terminated." The words were cold, clinical, a death sentence for her job. But for Elena, the words barely registered. The loss of this job, which she had taken only out of necessity, was nothing compared to the losses she had already endured. The humiliation was not for her. The true humiliation belonged to the billionaire who had to resort to such a petty, pathetic display of power because he had finally encountered something his money could not buy. Without a word, Elena turned her back on both men. She walked out of the service alcove and over to the small locker room where the staff kept their personal items. Her movements were not hurried or panicked. They were deliberate, dignified. She calmly removed her black server's apron, the symbol of her servitude, and folded it into a neat, perfect square, placing it on a bench. It was a small symbolic act of shedding a skin, of leaving a life behind. She felt a strange sense of liberation, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer Elena, the waitress, the invisible ghost in the machine. She was Elena Ortiz, daughter of a ruined family, sister of a lost boy, and now, the sole keeper of a secret that could bring the most powerful man she had ever met to his knees. The game had changed, and she was no longer a pawn. She walked out of the locker room and through the main dining hall. She did not try to be invisible this time. She walked with her head held high, her back straight, her gaze fixed forward. She could feel the curious stares of the other patrons, the confused and pitying looks from her former colleagues. But the only eyes she cared about were Alistair Finch's. She did not give him the satisfaction of a final glance. She knew he was watching her, his victory feeling hollow and bitter in his mouth. She walked straight to the grand, ornate doors of the Sovereign and pushed them open, stepping out into the cool, crisp night air of New York City. The sound of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of the subway beneath the street, the cacophony of a million lives being lived, welcomed her. It was the sound of a world far removed from the gilded cage she had just left, and for the first time in years, it sounded like freedom. Alistair Finch remained frozen in the service alcove, the folded apron on the bench a stark testament to his Pyrrhic victory. He had won the battle, asserted his authority, and fired the waitress. But he had lost the war in the most catastrophic way imaginable. He had just thrown away the only hope his son had. The rage drained out of him, leaving behind a cold, terrifying emptiness. The magnitude of his mistake, of his arrogant, fatal miscalculation, crashed down upon him with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled back into the dining room and collapsed into his chair, his body trembling, his face ashen. He was surrounded by the trappings of his immense wealth, the fine wine, the crystal, the deferential staff, but he had never felt more impoverished, more utterly and completely powerless in his entire life. The invisible woman was gone, and she had taken his son's future with her. The journey home for Elena was a strange, dreamlike passage through a city that suddenly looked different. The familiar streets of her neighborhood, usually a source of weary comfort, now seemed charged with a new potential. The weight of her unemployment, the daunting reality of having to explain this to her parents, was a heavy stone in her gut. But beneath it, a new feeling was taking root: purpose. The despair that had been her constant companion for years was beginning to recede, burned away by the cold, clean fire of her resolve. She was not a victim of circumstance anymore. The universe had, in its own cruel and mysterious way, dealt her a hand. It was a terrible hand, born of tragedy and loss, but it was a hand she could play. She held the one card that Alistair Finch could not counter, and she would not play it for money. She would play it for justice. When she arrived at the small, modest apartment that had been her family's sanctuary in prison, the familiar scent of her mother's cooking wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. Her father was asleep in his favorite worn armchair, the television murmuring softly, a newspaper resting on his chest. On the mantelpiece, a framed photograph of Matteo, taken on his 18th birthday, seemed to smile down at her, his eyes full of the brilliant future that had been stolen from him. In that moment, looking at the quiet, fragile piece of her family's life, her resolve hardened from a liquid fire into unbreakable steel. This was what she was fighting for. It wasn't for revenge, which was a hot, fleeting emotion. It was for this. For the dignity of her parents, for the memory of her brother, for all the other families that had been shattered by the casual greed of men like Alistair Finch. She went to her bedroom, a small space that was more of a library than a sleeping area. Her old medical textbooks lined the shelves, monuments to a life she had been forced to abandon. She ran her fingers over their spines, the familiar titles a reminder of the woman she was supposed to become. For years, this knowledge had been a source of pain, a constant, nagging ghost of her lost potential. But tonight, it felt different. It was not a ghost, it was an arsenal. She pulled down a heavy volume on advanced hematology, its pages worn and familiar. She opened it to the chapter on rare blood disorders, the very subject that had once been her passion. She read the clinical, scientific description of Rh-null, of its incredible properties, its profound scarcity. She saw the charts, the genetic diagrams, the cold, hard facts, and she saw her path forward with blinding clarity. Her grief, once a paralyzing fog, had finally crystallized into a strategy. The encounter at the restaurant was not a coincidence. It was an opportunity, a cosmic alignment of debt and consequence. The universe had not been cruel. It had been precise. It had delivered her brother's killer to her, not to be punished by her hand, but to be judged by his own actions. He had built an empire on the principle that human life was a commodity. Now he would be forced to confront the true value of a single life, his son's. And the price would not be paid in dollars. The price would be accountability, a full, public confession, a dismantling of the lie that had built his fortune. He would not just save his son, he would be forced to honor the memory of all the sons and daughters, like Matteo, whose lives he had deemed an acceptable loss. But she knew she could not face a behemoth like Finch Pharma alone. Alistair was a cornered animal, and he would bring the full weight of his legal and financial power to bear on her. He would try to discredit her, to silence her, to bury her under an avalanche of litigation. To fight him, she needed more than just the truth. She needed a weapon. She needed an ally who understood the battlefield, someone who knew how to fight giants. Her mind raced through the news articles and reports she had obsessively read in the years after Matteo's death. There had been one journalist, a bulldog of an investigative reporter, who had written a scathing series of articles about Finch Pharma's predatory acquisition practices before he was mysteriously silenced and pushed out of his job at a major newspaper. His name was Marcus Thorne. He had been a voice crying out in the wilderness, and they had crushed him for it. He had a reason to want justice just as much as she did. All night, fueled by coffee and a righteous fury, Elena sat at her small desk, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her determined face. She dove into the deep archives of the internet, searching for any trace of Marcus Thorne. She found him not at a major publication, but running a small, independent news blog from a cramped office, his byline now appearing on stories that the mainstream media was too afraid to touch. He was a man marginalized, pushed to the fringes, but he was still fighting. She felt an immediate kinship with him. She began to compose an email, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She chose every word with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't lead with the emotional trauma of her story. She led with the facts. Finch Pharma, the buried cure for aplastic anemia, the acquisition of Biogen Solutions in 2016, and a personal, irrefutable connection to the human cost of that decision. She ended the email with a single, tantalizing sentence. I have something Alistair Finch needs, something his money cannot buy, and I believe you are the only person who will understand how to use that leverage for justice. She hit send and sat back, her heart pounding in her chest. The first move in a war she never asked for had been made. The next morning, as she gently broke the news of her job loss to her parents, framing it not as a firing but as a decision to pursue a new path, a notification pinged on her phone. It was an email from Marcus Thorne. The message was brief, cautious, and laced with the healthy skepticism of a seasoned reporter who had been burned before. But it ended with 2 words that made her breath catch in her throat. "Let's meet." The first domino had just tipped over. A seed of hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, began to sprout in the barren ground of her grief. The fight for her brother's legacy, for all the nameless victims of corporate greed, was about to begin. The meeting took place in a small, run-down coffee shop in the Lower East Side, a world away from the gilded opulence of the sovereign. The air smelled of burnt coffee and old newspapers, a gritty, honest scent that felt more real to Elena than the perfumed air of her former workplace. Marcus Thorne was older than his pictures suggested, his face a roadmap of past battles, his eyes weary but still sharp, missing nothing. He looked at Elena over the rim of a chipped ceramic mug, his expression guarded, expecting another conspiracy theorist or a grieving family member lost in their pain. But as Elena began to speak, his posture changed. She didn't cry, she didn't plead for sympathy. She laid out her story with the cold, methodical precision of the medical student she once was, presenting a timeline of events, a chain of causality that was as elegant as it was damning. She spoke of Biogen's promising research, of Alistair Finch's hostile takeover, and of the sudden, inexplicable termination of the clinical trials that would have saved her brother. She presented her evidence not as a collection of grievances, but as exhibits in a case she had been silently building for years. She showed him a copy of her brother's medical file, highlighting the specific blood disorder. She pulled up the archived press release from Finch Pharma, announcing the acquisition of Biogen Solutions for the paltry sum of $75 million, a fraction of its potential worth. Then she told him about the night before. She described Alistair Finch's desperation, his frantic search for an Rh-null donor for his son, Leo. And finally, with a quiet, deliberate movement, she pushed up the sleeve of her sweater, revealing the small, star-shaped birthmark on her wrist. Marcus Thorne stared at the mark, then back at her face, and for the first time, the weary skepticism in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, electrifying shock. He saw the whole story, the perfect, brutal symmetry of it all. It was more than a story of corporate malfeasance. It was a Greek tragedy playing out in the heart of modern-day New York. A slow smile spread across Marcus's face, the first genuine smile he seemed to have had in years. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but of a predator catching the scent of its prey. "He has no idea who you are, does he?" he asked, his voice a low, excited whisper. Elena simply shook her head. "To him, I was just the waitress," she replied. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes blazing with a renewed sense of purpose. "This is it," he said, more to himself than to her. "This is the one. They buried my career for getting too close to this story years ago, but they can't bury this." He explained that he still had sources, a few brave insiders at the FDA, and even a former scientist from Biogen who had been forced into retirement, all of them silenced by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. But leverage like this, the life of Alistair Finch's own son, could shatter those agreements. It could compel them to speak. The coffee shop transformed from a simple meeting place into a war room. Marcus began sketching out a plan on a napkin, his energy infectious. They needed more than just Elena's testimony. They needed a paper trail. They needed the original research data from Biogen that Finch had ordered sealed. They needed financial records showing the profitability of Finch's existing drug versus the potential of the cure they had buried. He told Elena about a contact he had, a disgruntled former executive in Finch Pharma's legal department, an insider who might be persuaded to help if he knew the Titan was finally vulnerable. The hunt was on. Elena Ortiz, the alliance between Elena Ortiz and Marcus Thorne was forged not in a handshake, but in a shared, silent understanding that passed between them in the dingy light of the coffee shop. It was the grim recognition of two survivors from the same shipwreck, finding each other on a deserted shore years after the storm. Marcus, a man who had been professionally exiled for daring to question the gods of capital, saw in Elena's calm fury the reflection of his own buried outrage. He saw not a grieving girl, but a weapon that had been unknowingly sharpening itself for years. Her intimate knowledge of hematology, combined with her personal stake in the tragedy, made her the perfect key to unlock a story he had been forced to abandon. He felt a forgotten spark ignite in his chest, the old, familiar hunger of a journalist on the scent of a truth so profound it could shake the foundations of the powerful. For him, this was not just a story, it was a chance at redemption, a way to reclaim the voice that Alistair Finch's corporate machine had so effectively silenced. Elena, in turn, saw in Marcus's weary eyes a map of the battlefield she was about to enter. He knew the terrain, the traps, the hidden landmines of litigation and public relations warfare that Finch would undoubtedly deploy. He was a mentor who had already been bloodied by the enemy she was about to face. Her own resolve, born of love and loss, was the fuel, but Marcus provided the engine and the compass. Together they began to chart a course through the treacherous waters ahead. Their strategy was not one of brute force. They knew a direct accusation would be crushed by Finch's army of lawyers. They needed something undeniable, a piece of evidence so damning it would leave Alistair no room to maneuver, no shadow of plausible deniability to hide in. Their target was singular and seemingly impossible: the original research data and internal communications from Biogen Solutions, the documents that would prove Finch Pharma had knowingly and deliberately buried a life-saving cure for profit. These documents were the Holy Grail, the sacred text that held the truth of Matteo's death and countless others. Their first step was to trace the digital and human ghosts of Biogen Solutions. The company had been completely absorbed, its assets stripped, its scientists scattered to the winds, bound by impenetrable non-disclosure agreements. Marcus used his old, rusted network of contacts, making hushed phone calls late at night, speaking in coded language to people who had long since learned the price of talking out of turn. Elena, meanwhile, applied her academic rigor to the task, spending hours in the public library's digital archives, cross-referencing old financial reports, patent filings, and employee rosters. She was no longer a waitress. She was the researcher she was always meant to be, her mind sharp and focused, driven by a purpose that was as clear and cold as a winter star. Each dead end, each disconnected phone number, each former employee who refused to speak was not a defeat, but a clarification, narrowing their search, guiding them slowly but surely toward the one person who might hold the key. The name they were searching for belonged to the man Marcus had mentioned, Julian Vance. He had been the lead counsel for Biogen at the time of the acquisition, the man who would have overseen the transfer of all intellectual property. Public record showed he had been given a lucrative position at Finch Pharma after the merger, a golden cage to ensure his silence. But he had left the company abruptly just 2 years later, citing personal reasons. To Marcus, this was a flashing red light. Men like Vance didn't just walk away from seven-figure salaries for personal reasons. They were pushed, or they fled. He was their insider, their potential weak link in Alistair Finch's armor of silence. Finding him, however, proved to be a monumental task. He had scrubbed his online presence, vanished from the corporate world, and seemed to have dropped off the face of the earth. It was a clear sign that he was either terrified of his former employer or deeply ashamed of the role he had played. The breakthrough came not from a sophisticated data search, but from a piece of old-fashioned human intelligence. One of Marcus's contacts, a retired court clerk with a long memory, recalled Julian Vance mentioning his passion for restoring vintage Italian motorcycles. It was a small, insignificant detail, a piece of conversational chaff from years ago, but it was the thread they needed. Elena spent a full day scouring online forums and niche communities dedicated to rare motorcycles, searching for any mention of Vance or his known collection. Finally, she found him. Under a pseudonym, he was an active member of a small, private message board, sharing pictures of a gleaming, cherry-red 1972 Moto Guzzi. He had inadvertently left a clue in one of the photos, the reflection of a sign for a small town in upstate New York, a quiet, forgotten place where a man could disappear if he wanted to. The hunt was no longer digital. It had a destination. Arranging a meeting was a delicate dance of persuasion and veiled threats. Marcus sent the initial email, a carefully worded message that was both an appeal to conscience and a subtle reminder that they knew where he was and what he had done. He mentioned Biogen, the shelved research, and the name Mateo Ortiz. He didn't ask for a confession, only a conversation. For 2 agonizing days, there was silence. Elena felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, the fear that this, their only real lead, would evaporate. Then, a reply came. It was short, cryptic, and terrified. A time and a place were given. A desolate service station off a remote highway, a place where no one would accidentally overhear a conversation that could destroy lives. Julian Vance was willing to talk, but the palpable fear in his digital voice told them he believed he was risking everything to do so. The service station was a relic from another era, its paint peeling, its neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat against the gray, overcast sky. The air smelled of gasoline and damp earth. Julian Vance was a ghost of the corporate shark he once was. His expensive suit was replaced by a worn flannel shirt. His face was gaunt, and his eyes darted around nervously, as if he expected Finch's assassins to emerge from the surrounding woods. He was a man living in a self-imposed prison of guilt and fear. He chain-smoked as he spoke, his hands trembling, his voice a low, raspy confession. He told them everything. He confirmed that Alistair Finch had personally overseen the burial of the Biogen research. He described the meeting where Finch had called the affordable cure a, quote, catastrophic market disruption, and had ordered all data to be archived and sealed under the highest level of corporate security, a digital tomb from which it was never meant to escape. Julian's guilt was a palpable thing, a heavy shroud that had suffocated him for years. He explained that he had left Finch Pharma after his own nephew had been diagnosed with a condition that a different, shelved Finch drug could have treated. The brutal hypocrisy of his situation had shattered him, forcing him to confront the monster he had helped to enable, but fear had kept him silent. He knew the lengths to which Alistair would go to protect his secrets. He didn't have the documents himself. To take them would have been corporate espionage, a crime that would have landed him in prison for decades. But he had something just as valuable. In a moment of either foresight or profound guilt, before he left the company, he had made a private copy of the access protocols and location of the off-site digital archive where the Biogen data was stored. It was a secure server farm in a nondescript building in Delaware, a fortress of data protected by layers of encryption. He slid a small, encrypted USB drive across the grimy table of the service station's empty diner. It was his penance, his one act of rebellion against the empire he had helped build. "This is all I can give you," he whispered, his eyes pleading with them to understand. "The encryption key is the patent number of the drug they buried." Finch's little private joke. "Once you're in, you'll have everything." The original clinical trial results, the cost-benefit analysis that weighed profits against lives, the internal memos with Finch's signature on them. It's all there. He warned them that the moment they accessed the server, an alarm would be tripped. They would have a very small window, perhaps only minutes, before Finch's security team initiated a remote wipe of the entire archive. They would have one shot to retrieve the data before it was gone forever. He then stood up, a man unburdened of a great weight, and walked out of the diner without looking back, disappearing back into his exile. The drive back to the city was a silent, tension-filled journey. The small USB drive on the seat between them felt heavier than a bomb. It was both the key to justice and a trigger that could bring the full, wrathful force of Alistair Finch down upon them. They set up their operation not in Marcus's office, which they now assumed was being watched, but in the anonymous, transient safety of a prepaid hackerspace in a Brooklyn basement. The air was thick with the hum of servers and the smell of stale energy drinks. Elena, with her methodical mind, took the lead. She felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. This was like preparing for a complex surgical procedure. There was no room for error, no space for emotion. Every step had to be precise, every contingency planned for. Marcus worked his own magic, setting up a series of proxy servers and virtual private networks, creating a digital maze to obscure their location and buy them precious extra seconds. The moment of truth arrived in the sterile blue glow of the computer monitor. Elena's fingers, steady and sure, typed in the long string of numbers from the patent application she had memorized years ago. Mateo's patent? She thought of it now. She hit enter. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a new window opened on the screen. It was a simple, unadorned directory of files. A digital graveyard of buried hope. The names of the files were chilling in their corporate sterility. Project Nightingale _clinical_data phase _2. Biogen acquisition profit analysis. Nightingale market containment strategy. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel Mateo's presence in the room, a quiet, encouraging whisper from a place beyond her grief. This was it. The truth, in cold, hard data. As she initiated the download, a small, red icon began to flash in the corner of the screen, a remote access alert. Julian's warning had been accurate. The clock was ticking. The progress bar for the download moved with agonizing slowness, each percentage point a small victory against the encroaching darkness. Marcus watched the network traffic, his face a mask of intense concentration, calling out the digital countermeasures Finch's security team was deploying. They were trying to trace them, to lock them out, to initiate the wipe protocol. It was a race, a silent, high-stakes battle, fought in lines of code and packets of data. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat, counting down the seconds they had left. The image of Alistair Finch's arrogant face at the restaurant flashed in her mind, and she felt a surge of cold determination. He would not win. Not again. With the download at 98%, Marcus shouted, "They're in! They're initiating the wipe! Pull it now!" Elena's hand shot to the mouse, her click severing the connection, just as the file transfer completed. The screen went black for a moment, then reverted to the login page. The digital door slammed shut behind them. But it was too late. They had it. On their encrypted hard drive rested a folder containing the complete, unvarnished truth of Alistair Finch's greatest crime. They opened the first file, a scanned PDF of an internal memo. The language was cold, brutal, and unambiguous. It detailed the decision to terminate Project Nightingale, citing the potential billion-dollar loss in revenue from their existing drug. And at the bottom of the page, a crisp, arrogant signature that Elena would recognize anywhere. Alistair Finch. It was the smoking gun. It was the nail for his corporate coffin. While they had been hunting for the truth, Alistair Finch had not been idle. The firing of a waitress from the Sovereign was a trivial matter, quickly forgotten. But his inability to find a donor for his son was a gnawing, ever-present terror. He had unleashed his vast resources, hiring private investigators and medical scouts to scour the globe. But the answer was always the same. R.H. Null was a ghost. His desperation grew with each passing day as Leo's condition worsened. He had also been alerted to the renewed journalistic interest from Marcus Thorne. His security chief had informed him that Thorne was sniffing around the Biogen acquisition again. To Alistair, it was a nuisance, a fly to be swatted. He issued a series of quiet but firm orders: increase surveillance on Thorne, remind old contacts of their contractual obligations of silence, and prepare a legal team to file a harassment suit if necessary. He had no idea that the waitress he had dismissed and the journalist he despised were now allied against him. The acquisition of the irrefutable evidence changed the entire dynamic of the conflict. Elena and Marcus were no longer just seeking the truth, they possessed it. They spent the next 24 hours meticulously reviewing the files, the cold, clinical data painting a horrifying picture of calculated greed. They saw the names of the patients in the initial trial, their conditions improving dramatically. They saw the financial models that treated those lives as acceptable collateral damage. For Elena, each document was a fresh stab of pain, a confirmation of the injustice she had felt in her bones for years. But the pain was now accompanied by a hardening of her soul. Her grief was no longer a weight that held her down. It had been forged into a sword. The question was no longer how to find the truth, but how to wield it. Marcus, the seasoned journalist, immediately began planning a media blitz. He wanted to release the documents to every major news outlet in the world, to create a firestorm that would consume Finch Pharma and its CEO. But Elena stopped him. She looked at the signature on the memo, at the cold, hard proof of the man's culpability, and she thought of his son, Leo, lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life. A public exposé would destroy Alistair, but it would not save his son, and it would not bring back hers. Revenge felt hollow. What she wanted was something more profound. She wanted justice, but she also wanted restoration. She wanted Alistair Finch to be forced to build something good from the ashes of the evil he had created. A simple leak felt too easy, too impersonal. The reckoning had to be face-to-face. Her plan began to form, a strategy that was both brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its emotional weight. She would not use the evidence as a weapon for the media, but as leverage in a final, private confrontation. She would force Alistair Finch to confront the human cost of his decisions, not in a courtroom or in the court of public opinion, but in the one place where he was at his most vulnerable, the one place where his power and wealth meant nothing, the sterile, silent waiting room of the pediatric intensive care unit where his son was dying. She would present him with a choice, not between prison and freedom, but between his legacy of greed and his son's life. The stage was set. She knew the terms of her demands, every word memorized, every condition non-negotiable. The invisible waitress was ready to face the Titan, not as a supplicant, but as the sole arbiter of his fate. The designated meeting place was a universe of quiet desperation, a realm where Alistair Finch's earthly powers were utterly meaningless. The waiting room of the pediatric intensive care unit was a small, sterile purgatory, painted in a shade of pale, institutional green that was meant to be calming but only seemed to amplify the ambient anxiety. The air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and fear, a clinical odor that clung to the back of the throat. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic beeping of distant monitors, a constant, electronic heartbeat for children who were fighting for their own, and the hushed, grief-stricken whispers of other families huddled together on the uncomfortable vinyl chairs. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a flat, merciless glare, stripping all color and warmth from the room, illuminating the stark reality that here, money was not a god. It could buy the best machines, the most experienced doctors, but it could not command a single blood cell to change its nature. This was a place of biological truth, and Alistair Finch was a king in exile, his empire a forgotten dream. He sat alone in a corner, a man utterly dismantled. The bespoke charcoal suit that had once been his armor was now a wrinkled, disheveled mess, as if he had slept in it for days. His silver hair, usually so perfectly coiffed, was in disarray, and a dark, unshaven stubble shadowed his gaunt face. But the most profound change was in his eyes. The arrogant, predatory gleam was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted emptiness, the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and seen his own powerlessness reflected back. He was no longer Alistair Finch, the titan of industry. He was just a father, watching his son slip away through his fingers, each beep of the machines a countdown to a future he could not bear to imagine. When Elena Ortiz walked into the waiting room, he didn't even notice her at first. She was a quiet presence, her simple, dark clothing allowing her to blend into the somber shadows of the room. She stood for a long moment, simply observing him, allowing the full weight of the scene to settle in her soul. This sterile, hopeless environment was so achingly familiar, a ghost of the room where she had watched Mateo take his last breath. When she finally moved, the soft sound of her footsteps on the linoleum floor made him look up. For a fraction of a second, his face registered a flicker of confusion, his mind struggling to place the woman from the restaurant in this sacred, terrifying space. Then, recognition dawned, and with it, a desperate, pathetic surge of hope. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling slightly, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. He approached her not as a superior, but as a supplicant, approaching an oracle, his hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, broken whisper, stripped of all its former authority. He begged, he pleaded. He once again offered her his entire fortune, listing his assets like a frantic prayer: stocks, properties, a private jet, a yacht. The words tumbled out of him, a pathetic, desperate litany from a man trying to use a currency that had no value here. He was a drowning man offering a chest of gold to the ocean that was consuming him. Elena listened, her expression unreadable, her posture calm and unshakable. She let him exhaust his pleas, let the last of his desperate offers hang in the sterile air between them before they fell to the floor, useless and heavy. Inside her, the image of Mateo was a steady, burning flame, a source of unwavering strength. She was not here for revenge. She was here as an instrument of a justice that was long overdue. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, clear, and devoid of malice. It was the voice of a surgeon explaining a diagnosis, precise and absolute. She told him to sit down. He obeyed instantly, collapsing back into his chair like a puppet whose strings had been cut. She did not take the seat beside him. She remained standing, a quiet figure of authority in the heart of his personal hell. She looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time, she allowed him to see the abyss of her own loss, the years of pain he had unknowingly authored. She laid out her terms, not as a negotiation, but as a decree. Each condition was a carefully placed stone, building a monument to the memory of her brother. Her first demand was not for money, but for truth. She told him he would hold a press conference, and in front of the entire world he would make a full, public confession. He would admit to the acquisition and deliberate suppression of Project Nightingale. He would read the names of the lead scientists from Biogen Solutions, acknowledging the cure they had created. He would explain, in his own words, the cold, financial calculation that led him to bury their research, to sacrifice an unknown number of lives, including the life of a young man named Mateo Ortiz, for the sake of protecting the profits of his existing drug. She watched his face as she spoke her brother's name, saw the flicker of dawning horror as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place in his mind. He finally understood that she was not a random stranger, but a ghost from a past he had tried to bury. Her second condition was one of restoration. He would use his personal fortune, not the company's, to immediately relaunch the research he had buried. He would fund it, expand it, and fast-track it through a new, transparent FDA approval process. He would build a state-of-the-art treatment center, a beacon of hope, where the cure would be developed and perfected. And her third and final condition was for legacy. This new foundation, this center of healing, would not bear his name. It would be named the Mateo Ortiz Foundation for Hematological Research. Her brother's name, the name of one of his many victims, would become a global symbol of hope and healing, a permanent testament to the cost of corporate greed and the power of a single life. The cure, when it was ready, would be provided for free, in perpetuity, to every single person who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay. His fortune, built on a foundation of calculated death, would be repurposed to create a legacy of life. Alistair Finch sat in stunned, absolute silence, the weight of her demands crushing him. It was a sentence more profound and more devastating than any prison term. She was not asking for his money, she was demanding his soul. She was ordering him to dismantle his own legacy, to publicly confess his sins, and to spend the rest of his life and his fortune atoning for them, all while honoring the name of a boy he had murdered through corporate policy. He looked from her unyielding face towards the closed doors of the ICU, behind which his own son was fading away. He was trapped in a perfect, hellish symmetry of his own making. He had built an empire on the belief that a life was just a number on a balance sheet. Now he was being forced to confront the absolute, infinite value of a single life. And the price of saving it was the destruction of everything he had ever built. There was no choice. There was only surrender. With a ragged, broken sob, a sound that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his being, he nodded his head. The press conference was a global media event, a public crucifixion held in the sterile, blue and white auditorium of Finch Pharma's headquarters. Alistair Finch stood at the podium, a hollowed-out shell of the man he once was. The cameras flashed like 1,000 merciless eyes, capturing every detail of his ruin. He read from a prepared statement, his voice a monotone, each word an act of self-immolation. He confessed everything. He spoke of Project Nightingale, of Biogen Solutions, of the decision to prioritize profit over patience. He spoke the name Mateo Ortiz, his voice cracking for a single, agonizing moment. The room, once buzzing with the hungry energy of the press, fell into a stunned, profound silence. The confession sent a shockwave through the financial and medical worlds. Finch Pharma's stock plummeted into a freefall, wiping out billions in market value in a matter of minutes. Federal investigators stormed the company headquarters before he had even finished speaking. His board of directors, his allies, his friends, they all abandoned him, scattering like rats from a sinking ship. His empire, built over a lifetime of ruthless ambition, crumbled to dust in a single afternoon. Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Alistair Finch finally exposed the truth. 2 days later, in the quiet, anonymous confines of a Red Cross blood bank, Elena Ortiz performed the most important act of her life. There were no cameras, no reporters, no recognition. She sat in a simple chair, her sleeve rolled up, and watched as her own life force, her rare and precious blood, flowed through a tube, collected in a bag that would soon be on its way to save the life of Leo Finch. It was an act of pure, unadulterated grace, a gift given not for reward or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. It was the ultimate tribute to Mateo, a choice to answer a world of greed and death with an act of selfless life. She felt no triumph, no sense of victory, only a quiet, profound peace, the feeling of a circle finally, painfully, closing. She was honoring her brother not by seeking vengeance, but by embodying the compassion that men like Alistair Finch had lost. Weeks turned into months. Leo Finch made a full and miraculous recovery. Alistair, stripped of his company and facing a mountain of criminal charges, was a changed man. His days were spent not in boardrooms, but by his son's bedside, and then, fulfilling his promise, overseeing the establishment of the Mateo Ortiz Foundation. The first gleaming, glass and steel research facility opened its doors within the year, a promise kept, a debt beginning to be paid. Elena, meanwhile, had quietly returned to her life, supporting her parents and finding a new, simple job. She expected nothing more. Then, one afternoon, a thick, formal envelope arrived in the mail. It was from the Dean of Medicine at one of the most prestigious medical universities in the country. A group of anonymous donors, profoundly moved by the story of the Mateo Ortiz Foundation, had established a full, perpetual scholarship in her name. They had learned of her abandoned studies, of her brilliant academic record, and were offering her a place to complete her medical degree, with all expenses paid. The letter included a final, stunning offer, Upon her graduation, she would be granted a permanent seat on the board of directors of the Mateo Ortiz Foundation, ensuring that its mission would forever be guided by the spirit of the family for whom it was named. Elena sat at her small kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands, tears of overwhelming gratitude and release streaming down her face. Her stolen future had been returned to her, not by the man who had taken it, but by a world that had been inspired by her quiet courage. The path that had been destroyed years ago had reappeared before her, brighter and more meaningful than she had ever dared to dream. Her journey was no longer about avenging the past, but about building a better future, about becoming the healer she was always meant to be. The final scene of her transformation was not one of drama, but of quiet, powerful purpose. Years later, Drive. Elena Ortiz, her doctor's white coat worn with the same quiet dignity as her old waitress uniform, stood on a balcony overlooking the main atrium of the Mateo Ortiz Foundation. Below her, families from all over the world received the life-saving treatment that had been denied to her own brother, their faces filled with the hope she had fought so hard to restore. She looked at her own wrist, at the small star-shaped mark that had once been a secret symbol of loss, and saw it now for what it truly was. A crest of resilience, a map of her purpose, a constant reminder that the value of a single, compassionate life is a force more powerful than any fortune, and that true justice is not about tearing down the old world, but about having the courage to build a new one in its place. If Elena Ortiz's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.